Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night from all corners of the globe. I am your host, Michael Swigert, here on the New Human Project podcast. For the 5th episode, we will be speaking with Dylan Smith. Dylan is a historian and expert Eastern Woodland Native craftsman. Dylan specializes in Native American material culture of the 18th century North American tribes. Stay tuned as we discuss and learn about the complex and colorful culture of Eastern Woodland tribes here on the New Human Project podcast. So I was curious if you could tell me a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, and how you got involved in Native American craft work.
Yeah, so I grew up in Maine mostly, southern Maine, around the Portland area. That's where I went to school. And then after that, I went to the University of Maine, Orono, and I got involved with the Native Studies program there. That's basically what I majored in anthropology, but minored in Native Studies and history, so that I got to work with a bunch of really great teachers and like people like tribal preservation officers and also the Penobscot Nation and stuff like that, Wabanaki Public Health and other things like that while I was up there. But prior to that, how I really got into this, probably around the age of 5 or so, I kind of grew up with an interest in it my whole life because my father is from New York and most of my family down there is Shinnecock Montauk. So I grew up with a pretty heavy, Native influence in my life, I would say. My family lives on the reservation and stuff like that. So, I go to the reservation pretty quickly. And then from there, I had other, Native people in my life and stuff like that. And as I got older and started traveling, I started meeting more and becoming connected with more communities and stuff like that. So I would say that's really how I got my start, was just through my interest in my family and stuff like that.
I see. I assume you're speaking about a reservation up near Maine. Is that where it says?
In Long Island, New York.
Oh, okay. Okay, I see. But you're originally from Maine and you grew up there. I see. Okay. So you mentioned you have a tribal affiliation with the Shinnecock tribe. Did I say that correctly?
Mm-hmm.
And is there anything, do you have sort of a brief history you can give of the tribe, or the location that they are, where they come from, and anything that makes them unique in particular?
Yeah, I mean, the Shinnecock are located on Long Island in the present day town of Southampton. It's towards the east end of Long Island. It's one of the probably the larger tribes out in Long Island, and they're mostly known for wampum making and stuff like that, even modern days, but historically that's where a lot of the wampum is being made, as well as the other coastal New England and lower New York tribes and stuff, and then that's being traded into the interior and up into the north and stuff like that. So a lot of the Haudenosaunee and other people like that are getting their wampum from those tribes, which I find it funny that the Haudenosaunee are known so much for wampum. I mean, they make great use of it, but a lot of your wampum is, originally coming from those areas because the quahog shell doesn't grow in the areas that the Haudenosaunee are inhabiting. So, yeah.
I see. That's very unique. I know. You also do a lot of wampum work as well, with like different sorts of like necklaces and beadwork and things like that, and earrings as well. I think you make some wampum earrings, and those, correct me if I'm wrong, but those are also traditional items as well.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah. So your name, as I know it, is Dylan Smith, but you have a native name as well, correct?
More or less. I kind of have more of a nickname.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's just it was given to me by my grandmother's best friend, who was Mi'kmaq, growing up, and she was basically like a grandmother to me. Really helped me with studying a lot of my early histories and stuff like that. And she's Makwa, it's bear.
I see. Would you mind sharing what that name was?
Makwa.
Oh, Makwa. Okay, I see. Is there a significance with that, or does it mean anything in particular?
Not necessarily. So, it's just something that she would call me. So.
Oh, okay, I see. So I know you have a Facebook store as well, or a forum. What is the name of that? What is the?
That's Deherwada Denyas. That's my son's name. My son is Mohawk from Ganawage.
Oh, okay. I see.
And
That's
that's one of the communities that I work very closely with. I stayed up there for about 3 years, and I'm still very close with a lot of the community up there. I work their powwow, and I'm up there pretty consistently. So yeah, that's up in Canada. That's one of the nations that I work closely with, as well as a couple others.
I see. That's neat. So it's actually named after your son.
Yeah.
Neat. Oh, sweet. So it's nice to get to know a little bit about you, but let's go ahead and start talking about some of the things that you do and where your knowledge is. So, what did Native American clothing and material culture consist of before the Europeans arrived?
Obviously a lot of leather, a lot of fur, stuff like that. You're seeing some woven fibers. Maybe legging ties and belts, but also like tump lines and sashes. There are some evidence that people had woven fiber like shirts and skirts. You're also seeing a lot of shell jewelry, some copper, stone jewelry, stuff like that. So lots of feathers used, deer hair, things like that.
I see. And when you talk about woven fabric, are you talking specifically possibly about like plant fibers being woven into?
Cedar bark, other types of inner barks of trees, things like maybe even cattail, but milkweed and other things like that.
I see. And then for the beads and the shells, those the shells are going to be made of beads during this time. Those eventually turn to glass and imported products, correct?
Yeah, that doesn't really take hold until the mid to late 18th century. Real shell beads, as far as wampum goes, holds pretty true up until that time. But there's other shell beads that people are making out of mussel and other types of small shells and other things like that too.
I see. What kind of impact did the European influence have on their clothing and material culture once they arrived? And I guess we'd be talking probably late 16th century, early 17th century.
Yeah, probably. You see a lot. It's a slow change, but it's also a very rapid change at the same time. With the import of European goods, you see things like jackets and shirts becoming a very huge item. You see things like woven items now being made out of more European style materials. One of the really cool things that I love about the 18th century is you see all these European materials being made into native fashion and native clothing. So you're not losing your traditional clothing, you're just making your traditional clothing out of new materials. So it's something very unique and still inherently Native American. But going back to the earlier times, you're still seeing a lot of leather leggings and other things like that. But breechcloths especially start to become wool and what they call like half thicks and other things like that. Other terminology of the time to just refer to like wool stuff, woolens. So yeah.
And how would this have changed? How would this change have affected Native peoples, possibly in like their culture or religious traditions? Because I know there are some examples of earrings that are made of silver that are in the shape of crosses and things like that. And I assume this kind of came out of maybe necessity, but also the ease of access to the resources as well, as opposed to processing hides and things, because as I'm sure you're aware, hides take a long time to process.
It's for ease of use, right? You get a bolt of wool or a bolt of linen or something like that, and you can turn it into things immediately. You don't have to spend the hours upon hours or days processing the leather and stuff like that. And also it changes the culture into this economy that didn't exist before. You're now, it's a trade economy, but it's ramped up by tenfold, right? People are getting furs, beavers, muskrats, otters, list goes on and on. There's, whole trade lists talking about how much each fur is worth and what they can trade for and whatnot. And people overusing those resources now to get their commodities that they want that you don't see necessarily before that, right? And wampum trade too. Wampum is a big trade in the 17th century, and then the 18th century it starts to turn it more into furs. But fur is a huge trade in the 17th century too. But during the 18th century, wampum trade starts to die out.
Because you have several different kingdoms that are in the United States during this time, the 16th, 17th, 18th century. Does that bring up some sort of conflict between tribes who are maybe working with the British or maybe working more with the French? Like, how does that affect that relationship as well?
Absolutely. I mean, you see these different nations vying for power and control of the trade. You know, they want everyone to go through them, or, you know, to kind of subjugate and have rule over these other nations so that they can access their areas for getting more commodities or better trade opportunities. You know, having them pay them either like ransoms or like installment payments, taxes, essentially, that so they could get those items and trade them as well. But you also see, you know, native peoples, native tribes have traditional enemies, right? And these European powers come in and almost play them against each other even more, or makes one necessarily has maybe not stronger, but has more access to better trade items. So they're able to exert their power over their enemies that don't have the same access to the trade items and stuff like that. So you see all of these wars and all of these conflicts coming really at the hands of or influence of Europeans, either on purpose or not on purpose. So
I see. And conflicts, there were many, I assume. At least I know of a few in the 18th century, but I'm assuming there was conflicts from the time of the arrival of Europeans. Correct me if I'm wrong.
yeah.
So, given that there's this new sort of trade going on, and it's kind of the discovery of the New World, although it's existed for the same amount of time that the European continent has existed. What was the European perspective of native culture, and particularly dress and customs?
I mean, there are your outliers that look at native people as more human, and see the good they can take away from native culture. But over and over again, when you read the firsthand documents, they're talking about, you know, they're savages, they're not of God, they're, you know, scantily dressed by European standards, and they're lesser than. So
I see. And do we have any accounts of the native perspective of European culture and just at the time? Was there any sort of way that the native people, any sort of resources or sources that exist that have your Native American commentation on that?
there's definitely a lot less. What I can pull out of my memory would be that they're hairy. They dress weird. You know, they're clad in armor and have guns and stuff like that, as well as their dress is very weird to, you know, a culture that hasn't seen this dress before, right? And a culture where most people are plucking out a lot of their body hair as well. Seeing people with full beards and stuff like that is a little bit more on the rare side. Not saying that Native people don't have facial hair. There are depictions of Native people having facial hair, but it's typically not as much as their European counterparts.
Yeah, that makes sense. I believe I remember reading a European source that described Native Americans as almost Mediterranean, but without the same amount of body hair. And that's particularly common amongst Eastern woodland tribes, correct? The removal of body hair by physically plucking it out. And there's a lot of unique hairstyles that come along with that too. How does native clothing and dress appear different between seasons?
Obviously, for different seasons, you're going to be wearing a lot of clothing, right? So I worked at Plymouth Plantation, now Plymouth Patuxent Museums, and we'd be outside as a native interpreter, or working in the village and so on and so forth, dressed, you know, for the season, right? During the summertime where it's 90 degrees and, you know, it's sunny and whatever, you know, you're probably just running around in a breechcloth. If I was gonna go in the woods, walk through some thorns and stuff like that, I might throw on my leggings and moccasins. But your body gets pretty used to walking over that stuff too, so a lot of time you're barefoot too. Just because moccasins do wear out pretty quickly on things like sand, gravel, and other things like that. So not that people wouldn't wear them, but you don't necessarily need them all the time. Your fall comes, you're probably going to be wearing your breechcloth, yeah, but more your leggings and moccasins more because it is getting a little bit colder. You might throw on a shirt or a mantle or some kind of blanket or something like that. Obviously, winter you're layering up leggings, moccasins, shirt, mantle, blankets, things of that nature. Maybe even skirts to protect around skirts and aprons to protect around your upper thighs and things like that. And then it kind of goes back to the same thing for spring and then summer again. So.
Yeah, so just to clarify for people who maybe aren't as familiar with this sort of dress, at least in Eastern Woodland tribes, they don't necessarily wear pants, correct? It's breechclout and leggings, but more often than not, it could just actually be just a breechclout. What is a breechclout? How would you describe what that piece of clothing is like?
It's just a piece of leather or some kind of trade material, usually wool, that goes between your legs, and one side hangs over a belt and covers the front, and one side hangs over the back and covers the back. One of the biggest things for the Eastern Woodlands one, compared to like maybe say the Plains one that people might be a little bit more versed in, is they tend to be shorter. They're not super short, but they're not hanging down all the way to your knees and stuff like that. Your leggings tend to be a lot tighter. A lot of our depictions show essentially skin tight leggings or very close to it, just enough that you can slip them on and off. And they can be pretty high, but they also tend to sometimes be pretty short, like right above the knee, a hand's length above the knee is what a lot of firsthand accounts that I've read talks about. So.
Yeah, so very, very functional clothing, things that you can move around in, but also, at least at the time, and if not today as well, it seems to be a lot less clothing per se. But that makes sense because they've lived their entire lives in the wilderness, so they're used to it.
Yeah. I mean, when I was dressing like that every day, your body does get used to it. Obviously, with certain temperatures, you will need to put more on, but you can withstand a lot more. And when you're active, running around, doing all these things, your body's generating heat as well. And especially during the summer months, it's a lot more comfortable to run around in a breechcloth than the European, English, French, whatever it may be dress. I'll tell you that much. You can go jump in the river, ocean water, whatever, swim around, and come back out. You dry 20 minutes later, kind of deal. So yeah.
Yeah, of course, and that makes sense as to why possibly the Europeans were perplexed that they were wearing such little clothing, but at the same time, the natives were also very perplexed as well, because when it's 90 degrees in the summer and it's really hot, why would you be covered in wool head to toe? It doesn't really make sense. So definitely a clash of cultures most likely there. So we kind of touched on this already, but I was curious, how would you describe dress in sort of the working sense versus the ceremonial or the religious or political events? Because not only in native ceremonial events, but also in respect to when they're meeting with Europeans, how does that dress sort of differ?
Your everyday dress is going to be dumbed down for the most part. You're going to be wearing your bare bones kind of thing, nothing too fancy, most likely. Just because it's like, we get dressed every day. We're not putting on our best dress. You put dressing for the day. If you're going to be working outside and, maybe getting dirty and whatnot, you don't want to ruin your nice things. When you're going to something that has more, ceremonial or political connotations, you're going to put on your best stuff, all your fancy trade items, all your really nice shell jewelry, quill work, painted items, metal work, so on and so forth. You're dressing to the nines like, someone might do today. So.
Yeah, of course. You're not going to wear a suit if you're going to the gym, essentially.
Right.
So that makes sense. Very practical use. And so now I want to talk a little bit about, more specifically the things that you do. So you have a very unique skill that you work on, not just native crafts in general, but quill work. So for people who are unfamiliar with that, what is quill work?
Quill work is essentially just taking porcupine quills and using them, different sewing methods to essentially decorate and create different patterns on different materials. You're doing it mostly on brain tan leather, but you can do it on knife sheaths, you can do it on moccasins, you can do it on pouches, bags. The list goes on and on and on of all the different types of quilt things that people are having during the time period historically as well. And it's really cool because it's one of those crafts that are uniquely native, right? This isn't developed really anywhere else other than the North America.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a skill to have. It's not particularly easy to do that.
It's definitely not. I know a lot of people that have tried and say it's too frustrating and have given up on it. I've taught a lot of people how to do it as well. It definitely takes a lot of commitment and a lot of time, a lot of practice. I probably spent my whole first year doing it every day for at least a couple hours to really get to a point where like I could start making stuff and it looked good.
Yeah, of course. So really using those resources to your benefit and making some unique creations with them because they are colored as well, correct? Like they are dyed different colors to create different patterns and things like that.
This is the Reuploaded, and yes.
So what is there any sort of cultural significance at quill work in Eastern Woodland Native tribes, and particularly in your tribe as well? Is there any sort of connection, or does it mean anything in particular?
A lot of different tribes have specific. If you study the quill work, you can almost tell what tribe that quill work is coming from. There's a few that could go either way, but there are specific aspects of quill work that you see throughout like different tribes and stuff like that. So especially in the 18th century, the boom of quill work comes. Earlier quill work is a lot more dumbed down and stuff like that. But with the introduction of metal needles, it can go a lot quicker and you can do a lot more different techniques and stuff like that as well. So you see this big boom in the 18th century of quill work, and those specific styles and things like that really taking hold.
That's very unique. So you can actually look at a knife sheath or a pair of moccasins, and for the most part, by looking at the patterns, depending on the time period, you can kind of figure out what tribe it may actually be affiliated with.
Yeah, definitely.
That's unique. And so I guess as best as you could, how could you describe the process of making a quill work piece from scratch, starting with sort of the bare basics of the leather? I know you make a lot of knife sheaths. Maybe you can talk about the process of that, or moccasins. Well, we can talk about moccasins later.
So one of my biggest ones, like you said, is knife sheaths that I'm always making. People like knife sheaths. It's one of the centerpieces for a lot of people. So what I'm gonna do for a knife sheath is I typically try to draw out what I want just so I can visualize it, work on all the aspects that I want to put into this knife sheath. After that, I'm going to get my brain tan, draw out the design of the sheath itself, cut that out, and then I'll put on it after that, draw onto it what I want to do with the quill work. I'll draw out all the rows that I'm going to be quilling, the different designs and things like that. And then after that, I'll start quilling it. I use some beading needles, some thread, and then I'll take the back and then start quilling it. Getting all my different colors and stuff like that sorted out for the different sizes that I need. Some I'll have pre-sorted and stuff like that, just for it to go quicker. If I need to dye more, I'll dye more. I usually use natural dyes on most of my quill work and stuff like that. And then, you know, after a couple days of working, you'll kind of get your finished product, sew it all together, add any extras that need to be added on, say like beadwork or cones, and then it's ready to go. You know, there's different techniques and different that you'll use to complete a knife sheath too, especially when it comes to, say, edging. So edging is just kind of the border of the knife sheath itself. So you can quill wrap it, you can bead it, you can do a amalgamation of beading and quill work, as well as line work and other forms as well. And then you can put a strap on it too. Some of them range from just simple leather cord to glass wampum, usually bias woven. You can use plated or wrapped quill work to make a neck holder kind of thing, or you can use silk ribbon as well, which we see in the 18th century.
Yeah, of course. And when you create these when you create these sheets and different things that you make, you're actually using original sources and references or patterns of some sort to actually create something that would be reminiscent of 18th century.
Yeah, so I've done a lot of research in museums itself and online archives to look at historical examples, surviving historical examples of quill work, especially knife sheaths and stuff like that. We, as far as surviving examples go, the most that we have are moccasins, and after that is probably bags or knife sheaths. So there's a lot out there if you know where to find them. And after a while, you get an idea of what things should look like too. So, you know, I personally don't typically recreate historical items to a T because, you know, that was made for someone else. It has a meaning to that person. I want whatever I'm making to have a meaning to the person I'm making it for, or myself, or whoever it may be. So I'll ask them kind of what designs or, you know, what they want it to look like, what colors and things like that. And then I'll come up with a design based on historical parameters.
Yeah, of course. And kind of going back to the actual construction of some of a craft, particularly maybe something like a knife sheath that actually starts with brain tan leather. That's a whole process in and of itself. So we're talking, you know, today you may have the ability to draw and do different things. I mean, obviously they had ways to draw too, but with sort of the way that they got these materials was a whole process in and of itself. Killing a deer and then processing the hide, brain tanning, you know, that took a long time too. So really, there's a lot that goes into this skill, not just, you know, knowing how to construct it, but knowing to have the right materials. And so I've seen a few videos on quill work, and it does seem decently difficult, I would say, because you correct me if I'm wrong, you have to wet the porcupine quills to actually get them to be bent.
Yeah, so they become malleable in water. Traditionally, people are putting it in their mouths and stuff like that to soak it. Porcupines are pretty dirty animals, so I typically don't recommend that. I will every once in a while, but yeah, I usually just soak them in a bin of water and then, you know, get going that way. So
yeah, of course. And when you actually use the porcupine quills too, you have to clear the I don't know if it's keratin, or I think the porcupine quill might be made of keratin, but there's actually, the porcupine quill has some sort of flesh inside of it that you have to clear out as well.
You don't necessarily want to clear it out because then you'll lose almost the color or the strength of it, but you flatten it.
Gotcha. Now, when you're talking about the construction of quill work patterns, there's a couple of different ways that you can do that, correct?
So the typical style that I'm using is what's considered like folded quill work. So that's where you're taking it and going from one side of your kind of line that you're quilling to the other side, and it makes almost this bar, right? And then after that, I'll use a lot of line work, which is just using the quill singularly going down, either edging or making certain designs and things like that. And then the third most that I use is probably wrapping things. A lot of people like a nice wrapped edge on whatever it is that they're having, so that is that outline of the item itself. Kind of adding just more color and more design, a more finished look, and things like that. Some of the other things I use is wrapping leather and other things like that. And then plating, which is a blade, almost like a braiding mechanism that you use to make, different designs and things like that. So, yeah.
So another thing that I know that you do, one of the other products that I've seen on, or crafts that I've seen on your site as well, is you make a lot of woven sashes, correct? So what is, oh, sorry.
Oh, I was going to say woven sash, hair pieces, sashes, straps, garters, legging tie drops, things like that. So.
Yeah. And what is the sash used for? What are those sort of used
It's just a piece that people wear, typically for higher fashion, right? It looks really cool, especially with the beads woven and stuff like that. So it's definitely a piece that stands out, and it's kind of just this fashionable piece, but also it can hold things. Like when I wear one, sometimes I'll put my war club in it, or maybe put some kind of bag hanging over it or something like that. So it also can hold other things, but also so can the belt that's holding up your breechcloth. So.
Yeah, of course. And do you have any examples of some common patterns that you'll see in like the beadwork on these sashes?
Mm-hmm. So my brother actually does the weaving, right? You see a lot of zigzag patterns, diamonds. Some things have like circles, and other things like that. But the style of weaving is called oblique weaving, right? And it's another weave that is an art form that is specifically native to America, especially the Eastern Woodlands, southeastern regions, stuff like that. So yeah, it again takes a big leap in the 18th century, especially the mid 18th century and later, early 19th century as well. But yeah, that's essentially what you're seeing for like oblique woven items and things like that.
Yeah, of course. I've heard it referred to as finger weaving. Is that correct?
Finger weaving would typically refer to a different style of weaving.
Gotcha.
But it is done with your fingers, and it's not done with a loom or anything like that.
Gotcha. I see. That makes it sense as to why maybe it has been misnomered to that. So, but I assume that that's a very difficult skill in and of itself, to be able to weave things but with your hands, and that takes probably a long time as well, I'm assuming.
Yeah, like a sash, you're probably looking at about a month's worth of work for the most part. Obviously, smaller things obviously take less time, but it is a pretty time consuming, and again, another art form that is a hard kind of art form to master and learn.
Earlier you mentioned moccasins, and that most of the time they would have been barefoot, but what is unique about Eastern Woodland moccasins? Because they're not the same as the moccasins that exist in sort of the Western United States. What's unique about those?
Typically over in the Eastern Woodlands, you're looking at pucker toe moccasins or center seam moccasins. The really cool thing about moccasins is, again, just based on the style and the way that the moccasins are made, you can tell where those moccasins are coming from, different cultural regions and things like that. But on top of that, you also have a variation of moccasins. Like you have your center seam and your pucker toe, but you also have winter moccasins, these boot moccasins that have these higher kind of parts to them that might wrap around your calf or your shin area and stuff like that, and tied up as well. And then there's a winter style that has a vamp sewn into it as well. But you also see these pucker toe moccasins that have these high boot-like styles that don't wrap around too. So there are different variations throughout time that you see of these moccasins.
Yeah, and And I believe that they also may have used wool to line the moccasins, especially in colder weather, for more
Um,
warmth.
we see a couple things. One of the major things that we see, especially before contact, are moccasins made with fur on the inside for winter ones, bear hide, deer hide, other things like that. We also see wool inserts. So people aren't necessarily lining the moccasin with them, but you'll make like almost a wool moccasin, put that on, and then put your moccasin on, or wrapping your foot in wool or fur or other things like that.
I see. So basically, the historic concept of wearing wool socks in the winter.
Well, you do see wool socks becoming a big trade item as well. Mhm.
Specifically, moccasins, those are typically always made with either elk hide or brain tan deer hide, correct?
Yeah, you see a lot made of, like you said, deer hide or elk hide. You also see bear hide, moose hide, woodchuck, other things like that. But typically, elk, bear, deer are some of the ones I see listed the most in firsthand accounts.
Yeah, of course. And then with the hides, what is sort of the properties of a brain tan deer hide? Because that's not the same sort of processing that we would have with leather today. And how
Right.
does that sort of react with the environment?
Um, the brain tan hide, when you're tanning it, it doesn't destroy the kind of the skin layer of the leather. So that's one reason you can quill on it versus our commercial tan hides. Commercial tan hides destroys that skin layer, right? It's a lot more pliable, softer, and it also, I don't want to say like less water resistant, because when you smoke it, it becomes it has a defense barrier against water and things like that. But it can be a little bit more susceptible to the elements and things like that.
So I know another one of the items that you make is you make a lot of Eastern Woodland native headdresses. What do these kind of look like? Because there's kind of a conception of, a lot of the things that you see in media is typically the Western style Native American headdresses and stuff. What are these ones in the Eastern Woodlands? What do these primarily consist of?
You see a lot of essentially quill bands, quill wrap bands, and things like that, as well as like folded quill work on the brown, stuff like that. But your typical ones are either implated as well, or a lot of it come from like a Haudenosaunee background. You see a quill wrap tube on it, um, and it holds some feathers or decorations, ivory beak, woodpecker, scalps and heads, beaks on it, as well as, like I said, there's some that have these quill wrapped slats, either birch bark, ash, rawhide, and they're either go around the front or on the sides of it in multiple layers or one layer, as well as plated, maybe a couple inches thick. And they look very different than your plains headdresses that most people are thinking of, right?
Yeah, of course. And that's why I wanted to bring that up because I know they're very, very different than those, And the other thing I was curious about too is are there any sort of items or crafts that are more particular to one gender or the other? And is there any sort of crafting that is particular to a gender as well?
Yeah, for the most part, a lot of the stuff that I make typically would have been done by women, actually. So weaving, quill work, things like that typically are done by women historically. Nowadays, it's anyone's game, but not that men probably didn't know how to do these things, but most of your stuff, a lot of your really elaborate stuff is done by women. They're around the villages, around the homes more and stuff like that. While the men are out clearing fields and hunting, trapping, and other things like that. So they have a little bit more time where they're maybe sitting around working on things and not out going moving around. Maybe you're cooking a meal, you're waiting for that meal to be done, and you're working on that, things then, or at the end of the night around the fire and things like that. So yeah, a lot of the really intricate stuff that you see nowadays tends to be more women's work historically, making moccasins and clothing and other things like that.
So what kind of challenges have you faced in trying to preserve these techniques and the crafting that you do? Because it's very unique.
I think one of the biggest challenges is getting people to move away from kind of the modern regalia that people are wearing and stuff like that. A lot of people like the old stuff, but don't have enough knowledge or research in that background to kind of understand how things are done or why things are done, or how things should look, right? I find that to be a pretty big challenge sometimes, as well as, just these are things that, you have to put a lot of time and research into. So, there's questions that, I have maybe of something that may never be answered because you're just going through firsthand documents and surviving pictures. We only get such a small glimpse of what things are, how they're used. And, if you could go back in time and see these things and ask these questions and things like that, we would have a more a fuller picture, I guess, of what certain things were and kind of our assumptions on how they're used and other things like that.
Yeah, I would assume too that that can be difficult archaeologically speaking too, because not only are a lot of the goods made of biodegradable materials that will decay over time, but also the initial historical interest of these sorts of things. I'm assuming, a lot of the history, the written history that we particularly have is from the European side. So it's hard to really, see a lot of these things. I'm sure that presents a problem when you're trying to research as well.
Definitely. Like you said, a lot of it's from a European standard, but also a lot of the things that we have for surviving examples are not your everyday things, right? We know what people are wearing for the most part every day, but how prevalent some of these things are, or even sometimes how things were made, or even people aren't writing things that for their time period and their experiences are kind of just general everyday things that maybe anyone in that situation would know. But nowadays, where we're in this modern time period, we don't know that. We don't see it because it's not, a part of our everyday life anymore. So,
how do you continue to spread your knowledge of these techniques in the culture?
I personally work with a lot of different nations and things like that, doing a lot of different classes to teach the things and skills that I know. And anyone that reaches out to me, I'm giving any information that I have that they might need on how to do something or where to find something, giving examples, firsthand examples and things like that. I work very closely with my son's community and the community next to them, Ogwuzasne Mohawk. And I do a lot of classes. I used to work for a language and culture program up there, as well as, I work with various other communities that I'm related to, promoting, cultural knowledge and skills and things like that, usually for different tribal communities and stuff like that. I also do archaeology sometimes, mostly with the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy Nation, and, various other things that I might dabble in, so.
Yeah, that's some really unique things there. I think you've worked on a couple of documentaries too, correct?
Yeah.
And I have a question for you as well. This isn't particularly related to the history, but do you know of, in your opinion, are there any good representations of Eastern Woodland tribes in any sort of media, like movies or anything like that? Is there anything? Because a lot of the things that I see tend to be Western Plains Indians, and again, it's usually from the European perspective. Is there any good examples of European dress that people can look at? Or not European, Eastern Woodland?
Yeah, there are a couple of movies and documentaries and stuff like that that are pretty decent. A lot of the stuff that came out of the early 2000s is actually, as far as like historical documentaries covering like French and Indian and Revolutionary War and stuff like that, are actually pretty decent. there's some that obviously aren't, but you had a lot of people during that time period that was very knowledgeable about the culture for the time period. And obviously now there's things that they could change, but for the most part, this was before, our modern internet and where you could access things a lot easier. So, for what it is, there's a lot of good documentaries and things like that that do depict things well. Other things like, people are going to hate me for it, but Last of the Mohicans is actually pretty decent. In their clothing and other things like that, what they display, as well as they give Native people kind of a multi-dimensional aspect to them. You're not just attacking these people because you're some bloodthirsty savage. There's some backstory as to why these people are doing these things that they're doing. It gives almost a humanity to Native people. There's some short films and movies out there. I particularly like Jamestown, that series. They actually do a pretty decent job displaying the Powhatan people, I think, in their clothing and stuff. Obviously, some things that you could tweak, but for what we're used to and what we have, it's a big jump forward. Outlander, their first couple seasons are meh, but they get in the right direction later on, in their depiction of the Native people, as well as things like the New World, but it's like a Pocahontas story. They're actually their clothing and depictions and stuff like that of the Powhatan down there are actually pretty decent too. So.
Yeah, I actually I've seen clips of the New World, and I recently watched Last of the Mohicans. Well, I watched it this past year, and I was a little concerned going into it because I've heard a lot of different things about it, but at least to my knowledge of what I know historically speaking, I thought it was actually a decent representation of the native clothing, and like you said, I do like the more complex interactions that they showed with the natives and the French, and how they interacted with the English and French. I thought was pretty unique. I know it's definitely not a perfect film, but that's good to hear. I was a little worried that maybe what I was thinking was along those lines, but that's good to hear. So what would you say is the most rewarding part of the work that you do?
I just love working with the different communities that I have connections with. A lot of these communities I have family in, or people that like I consider family. So, being able to help these communities and people kind of bring back some of these things is super rewarding to me. Seeing communities, and people I know take these things and run with them and start doing these things. If I always say, like, I never started co-working or making things for any monetary gain or any like personal gain or anything like that. I started doing it for myself and for my family members and friends and stuff like that. And if the all the people I know are able to do this, that's perfectly fine with me. It's not my territory, it's not my skill. I just happen to learn it. So I love seeing other people being able to do these things and bring these things back and start movements in their communities and waves of, kind of things in their communities that people want to start researching these things and bring these things back, wearing them, making them, whatever it may be. So yeah, I think that's the most rewarding thing. And really all the experiences that I get through it, meeting new people, working with new people and creating connections and things like that. Definitely.
Yeah, it's definitely something uniquely native that you can't take away, or there's nothing else like it that exists. And I'm curious, you said there's you're really excited to get people involved in these sorts of things. Over the course of your life, have you seen any sort of revival in sort of native culture and customs coming back?
I know there were people for example, on my son's reservation that were into this before, but I noticed that it kind of died out as those people got older, and then now with a younger generation, I see a lot of these things starting to come back. Working with you know, a lot of the teenagers and young adults and stuff like that in that community, you know, I've seen a huge interest kind of come back, and people wanting to start switching their regalia and their ceremonial clothing and stuff like that to more of the older style stuff, and people wanting to learn about the older style and how to do these things and such. And it's something that never, you know, fully died out, but you see this huge resurgence in it. And even in other communities, you know, like for example, Pequot, Wampanoag, Narragansett, Shinnecock, things like that, you know, kind of in more my neck of the woods. Not necessarily 18th century dress, but 17th century dress, where, you know, a bulk of their history is at, and stuff. And, you know, it also, my son, you know, he loves to do a lot of the stuff that I do. He loves helping me with hides and, you know, all the crafts that I do and stuff like that. So, you know, just seeing even my own son like pick up a lot of the stuff that I do, even though, you know, he's so young, is really nice to see.
Yeah, that's really awesome. I'm curious, how many people are on the Shinnecock Reservation? Is that a conglomeration of a couple of different tribes, or is it just the
It's just Shinnecock. There's about
Shinnecock?
five last
Five.
time. Mm-hmm.
How many? Sorry.
500.
500. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And is there more spread across the country?
Definitely. There's people that definitely have Shinnecock ancestry in other tribes. For example, Shinnecock is really closely related to like Pequot. So I know a lot of Pequots that have some Shinnecock ancestry. There's also other people like the Brotherton Indians and stuff like that, that are these groups that came later in the time period, that are these amalgamations of different tribal groups and stuff like that that moved to new areas for different reasons. So yeah. And then on Shinnecock alone, there's people that have a lot of different, you know, heritage with other tribes on Long Island and stuff like that. It's like the Unkachog and the Montauk and other things like that. So
yeah, of course. So I know you touched a little bit on what you've been doing with some of the communities in your neck of the woods. Do you have anything that you are working on now, or that you can share with us, like any sort of big plans or possibly business expansions?
Summertime is usually my busiest time for that type of stuff. Because I'm a teacher, I get the summers off, and that's what I'm doing usually during the summers, traveling around, working with different communities and stuff like that. So usually during that time, I'm doing different classes and stuff. I work a lot with like my old job in Gunawaga and stuff like that. I work with the Agwazusne Mohawk community as well, doing different classes and stuff. And then also, you know, with a lot of time like Pequots, Wampanoags, Passamaquoddies, Penobscots, stuff like that, doing, you know, all types of stuff. I'll do some living history events and such with some of my friends and whatnot. So I'll probably go out to Fort Niagara this year, I think, and do some stuff out there, as well as, you know, just helping, you know, other people take the forefront. I never did this stuff to take the forefront. So I try to push other people from other communities kind of into the forefront for the abilities they have. I work very closely with a group of friends and family and stuff like that. You know, I'll probably do a couple films and stuff here in the future, I think, like historical ones for different departments and things. So yeah, some of the stuff I have on my slate for the next coming year or so.
Yeah, of course. Sounds like a lot of fun too.
Yeah,
so where can people go to find out more about your work, or learn more about the subject, and see the wonderful things you made? Because in my opinion, they're pretty amazing and they look super cool.
Thank you. I do post a lot of my work to Facebook and Instagram. You can find me on there under my name, Dylan J. Smith, or under Dehawardenius Creations. That's TEHAWERATENIES Creations, Mohawk word, so, you know, hard for most people to spell. But on top of that, you know, if you want to do your own research, nothing beats getting firsthand accounts and research, right? There's a lot of online digital archives, so things like the McCord, the Musée Quai Branly in France, the British Museum, the Canadian History Museum are some of the top ones that I usually go to for firsthand images of stuff, as well as the National Museum of Ireland has some good stuff. There's a couple in Germany and Russia that have some good stuff as well. But also, like I said, firsthand accounts. You can look up a lot of firsthand accounts. I like the Jesuit relations a lot because those are people specifically living with the native tribes, and they don't have, I find, as much of a biased opinion on things. They're really just observing, you know, what life is like and such. But one of my favorite books is Their Bearing is Noble and Proud. There's 2 volumes of it. It's out of print now, but you can still get your hand on it through certain people, and it's just a compilation of firsthand accounts of dress and kind of style and trade lists of the 18th century. There's another one called They Give the Scalp Hello. And that's an amalgamation of just firsthand accounts of all types of different stuff: battle tactics, dress, cultural norms, cultural standards, things like that. Really anything you can think of, there's a book that covers that. So yeah, those are some of my favorites and go-tos and easily digestible. You know, you don't have to do a lot of reading to get these small bits of information. School is another one. A lot of captive narratives give you a lot of good detail and information, as well as the journals of explorers and other things.
Yeah, at the very least, I would recommend anyone listening to check out your Facebook at the very least, because you have some amazing things there. And all of those other sources, some of them I've heard of, others I have not. I'll have to look into some of those, especially the books. But okay, before we go, I need to figure out how to say the name though of your Facebook page. Can you say that again?
They where then yes.
One more time.
Where then yes.
Where the yes. Here, I'm going to mute myself because I think I'm cutting you out.
The R sound in Mohawk, depending on what community you're from, makes a L or like a RL sound. So the dialect I speak is Ganawage, so it's a R sound. But if you're in Oguzesne, it's an L sound, so La. So it'd be Deha Where La Denyas, but over here it's Deha Where La Denyas.
Deha Where La Denyas.
Yeah.
There we go.
The easiest way to say it.
Gotcha. Deha Where La Denyas. Okay. All right. I finally said it once. Once correct. Well, Dylan, it's been wonderful getting to speak with you today, and I'm a huge fan of a lot of the work that you do. Just really amazing things that you're putting out, and I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today. And you know, I really enjoy getting to. I'm a huge fan of history, but I also like looking at the more niche parts of history and the things that are less explored. In particular, Native American culture, I feel, is very unique and very much an important part of American history that we should all know more about. So again, thanks for taking the time with me today.
Of course. Thank you for the opportunity.